Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Shauna Lipton. I'm the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and the Chair of the MA in Critical Studies program here at PNCA. PNCA is located on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Claflament, Clackamas, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes. While you are in the building, I invite you to look at the artwork produced for the Arrowhead Project and permanently installed throughout the first floor. This work was created by 8 commissioned artists alongside their communities and collectively represents an effort to indigenize and decenter colonial narratives within our institution. Tonight's event is presented by Critical Conversations, a program that invites prominent curators and critics to Portland to engage in studio visits, present a public lecture, and meet with local cultural producers in the spirit of intellectual exchange and creative inquiry. Critical Conversations is a collaboration between the Ford Family Foundation and the University of Oregon Center for Art Research in partnership with the Pacific Northwest College of Art, the Jordan Schnitzler Museum of Art at Portland State University, and the Douglas F. Cooley Memorial Art Gallery at Reed College. Through this program, I am honored to welcome to Portland tonight's speaker, whose work is an expansive, socially engaged, multidisciplinary, transhistorical, intellectual world-building practice. Being chair of the MA in Critical Studies program, interested in overlaps between critical theory and contemporary art practice, I've closely followed how the loophole of retreat has brought Black women theorists such as Sylvia Wynter, Hortense Spillers, Saidiya Hartman, and Christina Sharp to the center of contemporary art discourse, and the ways it has enabled intellectuals to operate more like artists. Creating this platform for the intermingling of critical thought and cultural production aligns with what Moten and Harney have called study. Study is what you do with other people. It's talking and walking around with other people, working, dancing, suffering, some irreducible convergence of all three, held under the name of speculative practice. And because this practice consistently forefronts the brilliance of Black women and femmes, it is also a form of what filmmaker Tourmaline calls freedom dreaming. Freedom dreams are born when we face harsh conditions, not with despair, but with the deep knowledge that these conditions will change, that a world filled with softness and beauty and care is not only possible, but inevitable. I want to thank Rashida Bumbray for accepting my invitation and being here in Portland for the week, dreaming and scheming and caring for local artists over dinners, studio visits, and backyard hangouts. She has been so beautifully open, thoughtful, and generous with her time. And now, to formally introduce Rashida, I would like to welcome Tina Wilder. Tina Wilder is a multidisciplinary artist based in Portland and raised in Summerton, South Carolina. Tina received their BFA from the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design in new studio practice and will be attending the Pacific Northwest College of Art in the fall for her MA in Critical Studies and MFA in Visual Studies. Wilder has exhibited and performed nationally and is the recipient of multiple honors, and they're currently the Art Bridges Community Partnerships and Curatorial Fellow at the Portland Art Museum. Thank you.
I am really short. Okay, hold on. Let me see. I'll just take it off. Can y'all see me? Yeah. Okay. Okay. It's an honor to be able to introduce Rashida. Thank you, Shauna, for asking me. And it's a little lengthy, so please. In How We Get Free, the Combahee River Collective, made up of Black feminists and lesbian freedom fighters and liberators, stated, "We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolved from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allow us to continue our struggle and our work. Although it should never be our job as Black women and femmes to fight and dedicate our life work to the liberation of our people, I have the pleasure tonight of introducing curator and choreographer Rashida Bumbray, who I feel embodies just that, and what it truly means to center, care, and platform Black culture, our art, and our community. Rashida Bumbray organized the Loophole of Retreat in conjunction with Simone Lee's exhibition Sovereignty at the American Pavilion for the 59th Venice Biennale. This retreat is one of the many profound examples of Bumbray's dedication to centering Black women and contextualizing and elevating the significance of our intellect, our creativity, and our spirit that is often ignored, discredited, and undermined. Spearheading the gathering of hundreds of Black women, artists, and researchers in a space that has historically excluded us, Bumbray had a direct hand in redefining the Venice Biennale as a place where Black women can feel a sense of belonging and affirmation. As the inaugural director of culture and art at the Open Society Foundation, Bumbray's aspirational work to collective liberation for those most under-resourced continues. Through her leadership, the foundation is a leading arts funder focused on the Global South and is able to support diverse groups of extraordinary artists and cultural activists who explore the realities of systemic injustices and inequalities in our society. To me, Rashida Bumbray's curatorial career reflects ideas of resistance, belonging, agency, and liberation. She coordinated exhibitions at the Studio Museum, including Energy Experimentation, Black Artists in Abstraction from 1964 to 1984 with Kelly Jones. As an associate curator of the Kitchen, Bumbray organized critically acclaimed commissions and solo exhibitions by artists and performers like Simone Lee, Leslie Hewitt, Adam Pendleton, Lauren Kelly, and Derek Adams, just to name a few. Bumbray's curatorial practice faces our intense histories and allows for important interrogations of art historical narratives or lack thereof surrounding Black artists. Bumbray is also a Bessie-nominated choreographer who draws from Black traditions and rituals and utilizes tools like magical realism to initiate intergenerational healing. Her practice helped me to reimagine a life as a survivor of the African diaspora that is empowering, connected, and worth fighting for. The New York Times named her moving work, Run, Mary, Run, one of the best performances of 2012, and performances have been presented by Tate Modern, the New Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Harlem Stage, Dancing While Black, and Summer Stage. Rashida Bumbray is more than deserving of her accolades, including being nominated for the ICI Curatorial Vision Award in 2015, being honored by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2018, and receiving the Alchemist Award for Socially Engaged Art from A Blade of Grass. Rashida Bumbray is a living reminder of what it means to nurture sisterhood, center Black womanhood, and to dream. To dream that finding a community is just the beginning, to dream of communal collaboration that can live through decades, to dream that our bodies gathering in one place is just enough to share our story and change the narrative. Please join me in welcoming Rashida Bumbray.
I'm not supposed to cry before a lecture, but thank you. It's so humbling to hear you speak about my work, which I think of really as a form of interdependence with my community of artists that I work with, and also those who give so much to me. So I wanted to start with this image as a way of thanking you all for welcoming me to Portland in such a kind way. And I want to thank Tina Wilder for that beautiful introduction, which was just so kind. Thank you. And I want to thank you all so much for the incredible invitation to be here and share my work and a few ideas here this evening with such a beautiful community of artists, cultural workers, and activists. Thank you so much, Shauna Lipton, for the invitation and for curating a truly beautiful week of visits and fellowship. And thank you also to Laura Hughes for your work and kindness in organizing my visit. I'm thankful to Willamette University, PNCA, the Center for Art Research at the University of Oregon, the Ford Family Foundation, and the Jordan Schnitzler Museum of Art for this series, which places me in such great company with previous curators and critics who have participated in the Critical Conversations Curator and Critic Tour. It has been such an extreme privilege to have such profound studio visits and conversations here in Portland. I'm extremely privileged to be making new friends and community here. I don't have to tell you all what a special place this is, but it means a lot to me to be here and in conversation with you all who have inspired me and opened my thinking this week. So thank you to Ty Carpenter and Teresa Reifert, Ella Ray, Julian Gaines, Travis Johnson, Sidoni O'Neill, Maximiliano, Sharita Town, Intezar and Studio Abioto, such an incredible family, Bridget Hickey, Lisa Jarrett, and Adrian Cruz, and all of the brilliant cultural producers I was privileged to meet at the lovely dinner at the Alberta Abbey. I still have some studio visits tomorrow as well, so it's just an embarrassment of riches here. For this lecture, which will begin with the grounding in Caribbean poet Kamau Brathwaite's theories of the Sycoraxian aesthetic and magical realism, I want to explore questions of strategy and visibility in art and curatorial practice by sharing a few projects and ideas that stretch across my work in curation and performance. How can the self-determined practices of our ancestors and forebears who developed means of navigating their lives as Black people in the New World serve as inspiration for our own work today? I am interested in the counter-hegemonic cultural communities that previous generations built as models for our own practices, to be adapted as platforms and structures that value improvisation, collectivity, interdependence, and subterfuge when the mainstream or the market fail us. I begin with the work of Kamau Brathwaite, Caribbean poet and theorist. Baba Kamau was my teacher at New York University, where he was professor emeritus in comparative literature before moving back to Barbados during the last decade or so of his life. Through his work and mentorship, I was brought into the world of MR, which is what he called magical realism, which, as explored by Brathwaite, is much larger than a literary genre. Rather, it is a larger cacophonous movement with multiple representations, the plural instinct, and collective improvisation, a radical disruption of Western progressivist history. Magical realism, from the perspective of Brathwaite, includes the forms, music, literature, and movement languages developed by Black people in the New World as a result of the catastrophes of colonialism and the Middle Passage. Brathwaite's Barabajan poems in 1994 gave voice to Sycorax, the silent African woman. A post-colonial interpretation of Shakespeare's The Tempest, Brathwaite's poems in this volume outline the history of the Caribbean through Sycorax's eyes. Set in the Caribbean, The Tempest by Shakespeare is a tale of the first New World conquest. So the character Sycorax, mother of Caliban, is the unseen witch whose magic Prospero has stolen along with the island. In the story, we never see Sycorax. She is banished and she descends. But Brathwaite makes an illuminating distinction here, that by descending, she does not die, but rather she goes underground and is submerged where she becomes one with the land and sea. Brathwaite names the Sycoraxian aesthetic to help us understand the dissident works of Harriet Tubman, Toussaint Louverture, and Queen Nanny of the Maroons and their communities, all of whom believed in the power of the plant, the earth, the roots of the tree, the direction of the stars, and the alternative to death, depression, and insanity. All of whom designed their massive uprisings and alternative communities underground. Underground spaces have long offered a strategic measure of safety and security, a cloak under which to imagine a reinvention of the future and a reordering of time. Senegalese economist and poet Felwine Sarr speaks about the imagination as a revelatory space, a space of necessity. Sarr says that the imagination is a highly developed tool among people of the global South and its diasporas, which includes the Caribbean and, to my mind, also the American South, and through the Great Migration, all of the places we have traveled, like Portland. The imagination, and I would also like to add the sort of heightened spiritual spaces that we can access are a space where we can flip or invert the concept of time that is only connected to progress, a concept of time that values Western spaces, civilizations, and states over the spaces, civilizations, philosophies, and states of the global South and its diasporas. And so for so many of us working in the global South, or from perspectives of marginalization within or in relationship to the West, imagination is a highly developed core strategy for survival. When I think about modes of survival and thriving for Black communities, I always think about the value of Black spaces. Black incubation spaces like my childhood dancing studio, which was located in the basement of our church. So literally an underground space. This was in a pre-gentrified Washington, D.C., which was still then known as Chocolate City. I want to think about the value of these Black incubation spaces in contrast to the contemporary realities of gentrification, displacement, erasure, and social forgetting. It was within this space, this underground space, where I was given access to a chain of transmission and the genius of Black repetition. Our teachers, Black women and Black queer men, emphasized the importance of repetition in our efforts towards the ultimate goal of dancing full out. And we understood that this full out was not only a physical state, but also a spiritual state where we could access a heightened experience reserved for those who have been given access to this transfer of knowledge. Access to a spiritual and psychic technology. Technology so ancient that they seem new, like the ring shout, like tap dance. Technologies which Kamau Brathwaite has called magical realism, which African people developed in the New World as an alternative to insanity. And these forms acted as a path to levity and freedom. As we navigate the terrifying context of our political reality, we desperately need these technologies. Our African American cultural traditions are our embodied archives. We can preserve and make these technologies active and accessible by tapping into the rich continuum of our ancestors and the forms that were developed by our ancestors. And they developed these forms during times which were not unlike today, and the racial terror that characterize our current reality. When I think about the kinds of injustices that have become commonplace, again, it is impossible for me to not think that the right wing are not also tapping into and invoking an ancestral lineage, but one of white supremacy and colonialism. I want to share an excerpt of my work, Run, Mary, Run, performed with my teacher and mentor, Adenike Sharpley, who was my professor at Oberlin College, and also with the Dance Diaspora Collective, which is a group of friends, people who I share spiritual traditions and work with, people that I've grown up dancing with, and people who have studied with Adenike Sharpley, who teaches, well, she's retired now, but she taught classes like blues aesthetic, blues and jazz dance improv, West African dance forms in the diaspora, et cetera. So in this work, we consider the harmonic ideas and tonal vocabulary of the McIntosh County Shouters, who are master ring shouters based in McIntosh County, Georgia. And we use this as a point of departure, creating an active ritual for the ceremony of the ring shout, so that the performers can bring the audience along with them on a ride through the cosmologies of the Low Country, Geechee Sea Islands, Tennessee blues, P-funk, and hip-hop, relating the shout to the larger history of Black music. And before I'll share this, I'll just say that becoming a student of Brathwaite gave me a prolific understanding of this post-cosmological disruption, which he also describes magical realism as a Caribbean blues perspective. And so as a result of this work, I was able to understand these traditions and turn towards the tradition. So turn towards the ground, turn towards the land, turn towards the sea, where you can listen to the singing of the coral plantation and he spelled choral Choral, but also thinking about the coral in the ocean. And to be submerged below the earth with my mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, those like Sycorax who believed in the power of the plant, the earth, the roots of the tree, and the direction of the stars, who had managed to survive and chosen to survive the catastrophe of the Middle Passage and the deadening silence of racism, white supremacy in their quarters, the plantation. So one of the kind of ways that Kamau would explain cosmologies was really to think about shapes, and that the cosmology of Africa is a circle, and that the cosmology of Europe, and it's very sort of essentializing, so bear with me, but it does explain a lot, that the cosmology of Europe would be the missile. So, you know, in many European kind of architectures, you'll see the obelisk, for example, or, you know, sort of versions of Egyptian architecture that mimic that, but that are like a pole. And so when the circle is pierced, that's an example of a cosmological disruption. And before I'll share this, I'll just say that these songs are Christian songs. So you'll hear references, sometimes you hear references to Jesus, but they're double entendre. I heard Black Thought say triple entendre. Songs that actually have multiple meanings and multiple perspectives. So while they're bringing a biblical story forward, it's also talking about you know, the crossroads. And so that intersection between the world of the living and the dead. So I'll stop and share this work. This work is sort of a way for me to transition to talking about my curatorial practice, which, as you mentioned, at the kitchen, where I worked from 2006 to 2012, I had the great privilege of working with many incredible artists on their first New York solo exhibitions. And Jamal Cyrus is one of those artists. Jamal Cyrus is based in Houston, Texas. He also is part of a collective called Odabenga Jones and Associates. And in the exhibition, he explored he described it as the work of Malcolm X as a directive. And in this work, this is actually an image of members of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense when they were organizing free breakfast for children programs. And this was also, and as you can see, they have bags in their hands, and those bags actually would say free breakfast for children on them. And what Jamal did was to think about subterfuge, to think about the necessity of covering, of cloaking, as a strategy for safety and security. And so this work in which he covers the, those that are working that day, he covers their faces with balloons and blurs out the image on the bag. It made me think about my aunt Suzanne Bellamy, who was a member of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and in the early 1970s, she went underground. And while she was underground, the FBI showed up at my mother's college and followed her around for a few days. And of course, she was terrified, and she called home to her parents, and my grandfather told her, "They're looking for your sister, and if they approach you, just tell them that you haven't heard from her." And so after following her for a few days, they did finally approach her, and she let them know that she had not heard from or seen from her sister. And of course, my aunt was underground in order to save her life and in order to continue the important work of the party, which in her case was largely focused on free breakfast programs for children. And it really makes me think a lot about the kinds of programs that we establish to help our community and how those are often read as dangerous. And what does it mean to be taking care of your community? My daughter famously when in kindergarten would tell her peers when they were eating breakfast, "Do you know why you have free breakfast here? It's because of my aunt, my aunt Suzanne." And of course, we were very proud that she understood that. But I think many people don't understand that free breakfast in the public school system in the whole country came out of the work of the Black Panther Party, who were simultaneously, as they were doing that, having to be afraid for their lives. And my aunt always cautions me about romanticizing their work in that time because I brought her to a film festival at the Studio Museum in Harlem when I was working there. It was the Black Panther Film Festival. And she kind of walked out halfway through and she was outside and she was like, all of my friends are dead or in exile, you know? So I just want you all to understand that as we're celebrating the work that was done. And so this is why I think about these kinds of underground strategies as important to art making as well, because we know that, especially around the world, and even in this context, artists are on the front lines of many issues. And artists are also historically the first ones that are policed, the first ones that are censored, terrorized, murdered in many cases. We can look to many global contexts for those stories, and then we of course have some here as well. And so sort of moving forward, some of my work at the kitchen also was with Simone Lee, who has become, you know, I would say my greatest collaborator over the years, and she made this exhibition at the kitchen with me called You Don't Know Where Her Mouth Has Been. And in this show, it was really the first time that Simone was able to show so many of her different ways of making in one space. So you can see the chandeliers here. Some of these works are on view at the ICA Boston now in her retrospective. But the cowrie shells, which she made from watermelon casts to make these chandeliers, are here. You can also see she has a recurring work with Uhura from Star Trek, and Sharifa Rhodes Pitts, the writer, plays Uhura in the film that she showed in this show. And then in the very back, you can see another chandelier, which is filled with rock salt, and then we use colored lights from the lighting grid because the kitchen is also a theater. And in that, she was really thinking, she called it Kool-Aid, and she was thinking about Afro-Cobra and the way that they were using many colors in their work as a political gesture. And this is just a close-up of this work. And in 2014, Creative Time invited me to curate a project as a guest curator to organize an exhibition with Nato Thompson, who was the chief curator at the time. And when he approached me, he said, I would like to do a show about race and space in the city. And I immediately said, we should talk to Weeksville, because Weeksville Heritage Center is a place that has been contending with race in the city since the inception of Weeksville itself in 1837. And a woman named Joan Bacchus Maynard, who passed away in 2006, who was a community organizer as well as an artist and a preservationist, she helped to actually recover Weeksville and actually begin gathering people as a grassroots effort to do archaeological digs and make sure that it was landmarked and preserve the legacy of Weeksville. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Weeksville itself, which was an intentional free Black community founded in 1837 by a group of Black investors. So there was a man named James Weeks who put down a lot of the initial funding to buy this land and build houses, because during that time, in order to vote as a Black person, or I should say as a Black man, because women didn't have the vote yet, and Black women certainly didn't have the vote, but in order to vote, you had to own land, $250 worth of land. So this was an intentional way of creating civic participation for Black people. And this is in a Brooklyn that was before the Brooklyn Bridge. Slavery had just ended 11 years before. Slavery was still happening in New Jersey. And so it was in many ways a sanctuary, in many ways a way to protect against the kind of racial violence that was happening during that time. And these houses that you see here are called the Hunter Fly Road houses. So Weeksville was initially built along an indigenous trading route called Hunterfly Road. And as Weeksville grew, it grew to be almost 500 families at one point. There was an orphanage, which wasn't an orphanage in the sense that the children's parents were no longer living, but that their parents had to go very far away to work because there was no Brooklyn Bridge. And so it was really a way of caring for the children in that type of scenario, shared caring for the children. And famously, Oda Benga, who was an African man who had been held at the Bronx Zoo. When he was finally released, he went to Weeksville, which to me speaks so much about the kind of sanctuary that was created there. And Weeksville was also the home of the first Black woman doctor in New York State. Her name was Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, and I'll talk a little bit more about her work because Simone was inspired by her practice to make something that she called the Free People's Medical Clinic. And this image is actually created by Bradford Young, a cinematographer who we worked with on the show. So we actually invited 4 artists to respond to the history of Weeksville specifically. And just to tell you a little bit more, Weeksville grew to be really huge. There was a newspaper. Of course, it was a part of the abolitionist movement. And so they had a newspaper which was actually being sent around the country, and part of it was around literacy. How can we teach recently recently formerly enslaved people how to read, how to be a part of society post-enslavement. And so there were many kinds of things that they did towards that. And of course, the architecture, my friend Sharifa Rhodes Pitts, who was also the Uhura in Simone's video, she wrote an essay about Weeksville, and one of the most beautiful aspects of that work that she wrote was really about the way that the homes at Weeksville were described with sort of a disdain about their architecture, and she described it as African brutalism. And she said that, what would you build if your main goal was safety? What would you build if you were surrounded by terror? And these houses are sort of a representation of that. These are the houses that are still standing, and they're on the site of the Weeksville Heritage Center. But after sort of the 1940s and 50s, the Brooklyn city grid began to grow. Many people did not live in Weeksville anymore. A lot of the original footprint of Weeksville was sort of cleared for more high-rise and also kind of, other kinds of like brownstones and townhouses. And this is in central Brooklyn, if you all are familiar with Brooklyn, right on the border between Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights. And these houses are still standing. So in the 1960s, there was a class at Pratt University that was sort of researching Weeksville, and the professor got access to a prop plane, and they flew over and saw that these houses were still standing. And that is what sort of became the impetus for Joan Maynard to begin this whole community process where there were church members, Boy Scouts, doing these excavations and archaeological digs. And sort of in the strategy of the 1960s, they sort of framed it directly around self-determination. And that the original impetus of Weeksville was self-determination around creating a community, creating a sanctuary. They had garden parties, there was a lot of beauty. There was herbalism. They found jars for canning and herbs that were, when they did the archaeological digs. So when Weeksville Heritage Center opened, they did some of the same thing. So there was a lot of oral history gathering, teaching of herbalism, teaching of gardening, and it's still one of the most large green spaces in Brooklyn, outside of like Prospect Park, for example. This is a picture from the Weeksville Orphanage, so you can see how beautiful the children are. And this is the work that Bradford Young made. And the process of the show was that we invited existing organizations in the neighborhood to collaborate with the artists on a project, because we were thinking about what are the existing sort of through lines that speak about these various moments in history, whether it was the 1830s and 40s or the 1960s when there was a resurgence around Weeksville, and the Bethel Tabernacle AME Church was one that had been, led by abolitionists and was a part of the Weeksville community. That church has an archivist, and so Bradford was able to work with the archivist, and he introduced him to the living legends, which are members of the church who've been members for 50 years or more. So most of them were 70s and 80s. And Bradford was able to photograph them and make this film, which was a triptych. And we placed it into a school building across the street from the church, which the church had owned, but they couldn't afford to keep it up. So when we asked if we could make the show in there, they said, yes, but this might be unsafe. And we said, well, this is what Creative Time does. It's public art. We will get people to sign waivers. We didn't say we'll make it safe. We'll try to make it safe. People will sign waivers. But what was most profound about it is that had actually been the church sanctuary for many years. So when we had the opening, we had a separate opening for the church. People started to weep, and they were saying, oh, this is actually where my parents were married. This is where I was christened. So, it really spoke to me about how gentrification robs us of memories, like the fact that the building was unaffordable and accessible, didn't allow the continuum to happen. One, the continuum obviously from the beginning of Weeksville, which had been fractured in many ways, but also just the continuum of a space that had so much love put into it. We also worked with Jamal Cyrus again, Otobenga Jones and Associates, and he was focused on this community center called the East. And if people are familiar, the East was a Pan-African, African-centered community center, school, jazz venue, publishing house. And it was started by a man named G2 Wayusi. And, once I started to learn more about the East, because Jamal Cyrus was obsessed with the East, and I'll tell y'all why, when I started to learn more about it, I realized that many of my friends grew up going to the East. Our children were in Little Maroons together, which was a similar kind of African-centered preschool, and they were like, oh yeah, we grew up in the East, and they started showing me pictures of the East. This was the first African Street Festival, which is now like an institution in Brooklyn, but it started at the East on the same block. And of course, in true form of gentrification, this block is now, there's no marker or anything to say that the East existed here. So Jamal was very interested in bringing, his collaborators together to think about how to give people back access to the East and its memories. And if you all are familiar with X-Clan, there's a song where they say, to the East, my brother, to the East, my brother, to the East, my brother, to the East. They're talking about the East in Brooklyn, which I didn't know. I thought it was like a prayer. And so what they did was to build this Cadillac that's on the cover of the X-Clan album and make it into a pirate radio station, which, also had programming happening. People loved this. It was like sitting in the middle. If you know Brooklyn at all, there's like the Utica train station. There's like a little circle right on at Utica and Fulton Street, and that's where this was. And there were conversations. This is Shawnee Peters and Ryan Dennis. There were many programs throughout the run of the exhibition, which was up for a month. So one of the beautiful things that happened is that G2 Wayusi, who had passed away, his wife let Jamal spin a set from his records, which was incredible. And also there were just many conversations about memories from the East. So there were young people and elders from the East that were a part of the radio station as well. And this is Otobenga Jones and Associates. From left to right is Jabari Evans, Jamal Cyrus. I'm sorry. Yes, Jabari, Jamal, Kenya, and Robert Pruitt. And now I will talk about Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, who I mentioned as the first Black woman doctor in New York State, who lived in Weeksville, and she practiced both herbal medicine and Western medicine. And Simone Lee was inspired by the history of Black women nurses and doctors in New York, in Brooklyn specifically, and also generally just the way that Black women nurses have overserved, underserved communities, and the way that they have been invisibilized historically and just, every day. And so the other sort of antecedent for this, which is important just in terms of understanding this idea of the underground, is that in Brooklyn, there is a chapter of the United Order of Tents. And the United Order of Tents are a secret society of Black women who have, who started, during the Underground Railroads, and also during the Civil War. They were actually on the fields treating the Black Union soldiers. So that's why they call the tents, because they set up tents for to do the medical work. The United Order of Tents also is the oldest Black women's organization in the United States, with chapters across the United States. So it was founded formally in 1867 by two formerly enslaved women, Annetta Minkins Lane of Norfolk, Virginia, and Harriet R. Taylor of Hampton, Virginia. The Tents became the first benevolent organization for women officially chartered in Virginia after the Civil War. Throughout its long history, the largely secret society has provided financial assistance and burial insurance, facilities to care for the elderly, support for orphans, and scholarships for African American students. While some of their larger projects and gatherings have been visible to the general public, the order has engaged in a primarily unrecognized community service. Annette Lane Harrison Richter, the great-great-granddaughter of founder Annetta Minkins Lane, also spoke at the Lupola Retreat in Venice and declared all Black women in attendance members of the United Order of Tents. So Nagara and I are members of the United Order of Tents. And so this was really important to Simone to begin understanding the history of the tents in Brooklyn and in general. But the sort of framing for what she built, which she called the Free People's Medical Clinic, was actually looking at the antecedent of the Black Panther Party, who had also built a Free People's Medical Clinic. And their clinic was focused on, at the time, sickle cell anemia, which was, affecting Black people in much larger numbers. And this is Peggy Cooper Kate Fritz, who is a mentor of ours. She started the Duke Ellington School of the Arts in Washington, D.C., and is a really important nurturer of Black artists, including being a collector. And she is now an ancestor, and so I wanted to show and honor Peggy, who showed up for everything. So this is an example. She was there when the clinic opened and was the first one to walk in. And the attendance in the clinic, so we were in a house, to speak a little bit more about the layers of this, which were sort of uncanny and then became really intentional. We were in a house that was owned by the family of a woman named Dr. Josephine English. She was the first Black woman OBGYN in Brooklyn. She delivered Betty Shabazz and Malcolm X's daughters, all of them. Her family still owns this home. And the clinic happened in this space, which she has, intentionally said must always be used for community purposes. So located in the house is a group of Black doulas, the Black Movement Center, the Brooklyn Movement Center, I'm sorry, a Black homeschool network, and then some other programs that sort of come in and out. And so for our clinic, we worked with the Black Doulas Association, which also had midwives, and they did well women care. We also offered, you can see sort of some of the classes that were offered. So there was navigation of the Obamacare platform if people needed to receive insurance. This was in 2014, just for context. There were classes, Afro-centering with Amy Cox, which was like a folk dance class. There was well woman care, like I said, with the ancient song doula, massage therapy. My cousin is actually a massage therapist. He's the son of my aunt, who's a Black Panther, so I thought that was a good sort of moment of lineage. And also, acupuncture, herbalism. Karen Rose taught herbalism classes. And one of the beautiful things that she said in one of the classes was that medicine was sung. And she said that that songs themselves are medicine, but also the way that we pass the medicine on was through singing. This is Amy Cox's class, and Simona's in the class with her. Oh. And this is where we did the community acupuncture. And the reason why we ended up working with Black women practitioners locally in Brooklyn was, one, because as we started to meet with hospitals, we realized that doctors could not work in informal spaces due to insurance and the way that laws have changed, unlike during the moment when the Black Panthers did their clinic, there were doctors working there. So in our case, we had nurses that were doing vital checks when you came in, the Black Nurse Association of Brooklyn. And then we also had local practitioners because we thought that continuity of care was really important, because one of the reasons for this intervention was the lack of healthcare in the neighborhood. And so we wanted people to make those relationships so they could continue after the project ended. And then, speaking to, which, I will sort of move into next, but really speaking into the idea of always creating space for Black women theorists and Black women intellectuals. There was something called the Waiting Room magazine, which Simone invited writers to contribute to. So Vanessa Agard-Jones, Nunsi Mutiti designed this Waiting Room magazine, and we had Sharifa Rose Pitts writing, as well as Vanessa Agard-Jones. And I'll find the list of everyone, but it was really an incredible publication. We have some of these in libraries that we donate them to around the country. So I'll stop now to introduce a little bit the Loophole of Retreat, which thank you all for introducing that in the introduction for me to come up, because it was such a deep honor last year to organize the Loophole of Retreat Venice, which was conceived as an extension of Simone Lee's U.S. Pavilion exhibition Sovereignty. So on October 7th, 8th, and 9th, Loophole of Retreat Venice took place at the Giorgio Cini Foundation, which is a cultural institution on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore, which is right across the canal from where the pavilions are and where the Venice Biennale happens. As part of the pavilion, Simone was really intent on making the Loophole of Retreat happen. And we brought together scholars, artists, and activists from around the world. And over 700 people gathered in Venice for this historic event, and thousands joined from around the world virtually through the live stream. I worked with Sadia Hartman and Tina Camp as curatorial advisors, and we organized this 3-day symposium really comprised of dialogue, performances, and presentations centered on Black women's intellectual and creative labor. And Nagara Ekadumu was one of the speakers, and she gave a really beautiful presentation about Toni Morrison, which everyone was like weeping and had a heightened experience, including Nagara herself. It was really a turning point in terms of the emotional vulnerability that people brought to not only what they were presenting, but how they were receiving it. And one of the reasons why that is so important is because many times as Black women artists and intellectuals, we are working in, I think with various levels of isolation. Not because we're not in community with each other, but we're often presenting our work in context or working in contexts where there are levels of isolation. And so to be in a space where, people would understand, one, your references and where we could reference each other. Like Rizvana Bradley gave a beautiful talk where, she referenced only other Black women scholars. And that was happening throughout the time. People were referencing each other. And the conceptual frame for the Loophole of Retreat was really built on the first Loophole of Retreat, which was a one-day convening held in 2019 at the Guggenheim. And Simone also had an exhibition at the Guggenheim. She won the Hugo Boss Prize, and during that exhibition, she decided to name it the Loophole of Retreat, which is really drawn from the 1861 autobiography of Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. You may be familiar with this. But Harriet Jacobs was an formerly enslaved woman who for 7 years after her escape lived in a crawl space she described as a loophole of retreat. And Jacobs claimed this site simultaneously as an enclosure and a space for enacting practices of freedom. So practices of thinking, planning, writing, and imagining. And that is the space that we wanted to reclaim for the Loophole of Retreat as a gathering. And the reason why she stayed in this crawl space, which left her with disabilities after she left, was that she could see out through a hole to see her children who were still there. And, you know, it sort of is a metaphor for what it can be like to work as a Black woman in various scenarios, right? Like, we're in a country that perhaps, you know, has the residues, and, you know, Saidiya Hartman talked about, like, I live in the time of slavery because I live in the future created by it. And so I think that we can think about that also as why we may still be inside of a loophole of retreat. And so the other thing that I want to say is that curating the Loophole of Retreat was really a visioning project. And, you know, it was about a 2-year process, but Simone said recently that it was a 25-year process because, you know, she's like, this is Rashida's practice over all of these years. These are her relationships. This is an ethos, which is, you know, humbling and I think also true. And we invited 65 Black women and femmes from around the world. And I think it was really important to us that the gathering be both transnational and intergenerational and interdisciplinary as well. And so we had participants from the US and Canada, from throughout the Caribbean, including Jamaica, Haiti, Puerto Rico, and St. Croix, as well as Brazil, participants from the UK, and countries across Europe, including Italy, and participants from countries throughout Africa, including Nigeria, South Africa, Morocco, Mali, and Sao Tome and Principe. And many people, even those who were not participating, 700 Black women came. Many people came from all over the world as well. And so we had translation, headphones so that, you know, people could participate in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. We also designed this in the spirit of important transnational convenings, like the precedent set by Festac 77 in Lagos, and Deb Willis's Black Portraitures in Johannesburg and other places. And it was really about understanding the continued and urgent need for transnational solidarity and collaboration during this critical moment for women's rights and trans rights, climate justice, racial justice, decolonization, land back, and the fight against this resurgence of fascism. So we built this platform as a space for global dialogue, and also around the incredible guiding ethos of Simone's practice, which is really based on an insistence on both the individual authorship of Black women and the necessity of collectivity. So rather than ask why the appropriate platforms do not exist for Black women intellectuals, Loophole of Retreat just decided to create it. And Simone has often spoken about the Black women artists who were her mentors, who worked their entire lives and never had a museum exhibition. And so it's very important to her to also create a space where, you know, that level of chain of transmission and continuum, and also that intergenerational exchange is visible rather than shrouded. So I think while I'm talking about this idea of the underground, because we know so much of our work does need to happen, you know, between ourselves, there is an importance, right, about showing some of those points of connection and sort of the grid. And I think what I also think about many times is that, when we do things that are more public, it's a way of giving something back to ourselves. Because that concept of hidden in plain sight, which I think is important as a technology and as a strategy, you also want it to be legible to the people that you want to see it and pick it up. So the way that, we were focused really on this idea of individual authorship and also collectivity, the spirit of the conference was really that each participant was issued an open-ended invitation to speak about her own work and practice, her own ideas, and highlight topics of her own interests. In fact, an early alternative title for Loophole was Carte Blanche, really reflecting an ethos of freedom that Simone wanted to animate the event. But as a larger framework for the constellation of presentations, we wanted to identify a group of directives to guide our collective thinking. And when the first Loophole Retreat happened, Tina Camp came up with a group of keywords. And Simone was, she said, I don't want keywords this time, like no anything. But of course, we were disobedient and we decided that we should have directives, which is what I called them. And the directives were maroonage. So Maroons refer to the people who escaped slavery and created independent communities on the outskirts of enslaved societies. And this directive for me was really informed by the artist Deborah Anzinger's explorations of fugitivity and resistance in Jamaica's Cockpit Country, which is a site of historical refuge and resistance for Maroons. And I had a conversation with Vanessa Agar-Jones when we were organizing these directives about maroonage, because much of her work has happened in Martinique. And she warned me against the romanticization of the idea of maroonage, because she said, it's wonderful that some people are were able to create their own communities, but what about those who were not? And so I think, it's important, political stance to also think about maroonage in concert with, people who were still left functioning within the horrors of, an enslaved society. Manual was the second directive, and it was inspired by the Manual for General Housework from Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval. And in this piece, she talks about the idea of meaning of or pertaining to the hand or hands. So the idea of manual labor, but also the idea of working with the hands, which I think was really important to think about. Many of us come from laborers. Well, all of us do in most cases, right? But also the work of making, whether it's art, music, often is another form of manual labor, right? And then magical realism, which I've talked a lot about as the magically real forms developed by Black people in the New World, a radical disruption of Western progressivist history. Medicine was also one of the directives, and that was inspired by how we cope with the natural and supernatural world around us using the qualities of science, plants, and animals. It draws on our approaches to diverse ailments, physical, spiritual, natural, and supernatural. For this gathering, we were considering the work of root and leaf doctors, traditional healers, and conjurers of the rural Black American South and the global South. And then finally, sovereignty, which was the title of the U.S. Pavilion exhibition, Simone's U.S. Pavilion exhibition, which speaks to notions of self-determination, self-governance, and independence for both the intellectual and the collaborative. And I'll just show some images from the 3 days. I should be saying people's names. Autumn Night. I'll go back. Tina Camp. Paloma McGregor. And I believe this is Jamie Filbert. This is when Kenizia Lubrin was speaking. This is Phoebe Boswell in the black and white, who gave a beautiful talk really about her relationship to traditional religion, being someone who lives in Europe, but her family lives on the continent of Africa. Autumn Nights. One of the beautiful things about being in the space where we were is that it's a former monastery, and there are all these very grand halls and spaces, and there was a pool that the technical director proposed to make into a black box theater. And so this is actually a converted pool where most of the performances happened. Okuyakposili. This is Ayanna Evans. As you can see, this was a very participatory performance. And this is the last day of Loophole of Retreat, which in the front row, let's see, from, sorry, from left to right is, why am I blanking on the poet's name? I'll come back. This is Legacy Russell, the second person sitting, Simone, myself, my daughter Zahara, Lorraine O'Grady, and Tina Camp. And one of the incredible things that Lorraine O'Grady said was that there's no fear of isolation now. Like, this movement is here. And many of us who were working in isolation no longer need to fear that. She also said that she's never been in a space where she knew that everything she said would land. All of her jokes were understood. And, you know, she said it was like talking to yourself, which is really hilarious because she's also, you know, she's funny, and she's also, how would I say? She's very confident. Oh, that's the last one. So I will stop to see if there are any questions. Maybe I'll just put. Thank you. I just realized it was over time. Are we okay?
Any questions?
Do I gotta stand? Oh, hope not. Hi, Rashida. I'm Christine. Just thank you so much for that just incredible, beautiful presentation and learning about your work.
Thank you.
I noticed like a lot of the words that you was saying or talking about with the art in your practice was like protection and sanctuary. And it was so heartwarming to hear that, because like thinking about a lot of Black art, it does go back to that protection and that sanctuary. And I was wondering if you could expand upon some of the work that you showed, or the loophole of retreat, back to your original point of, I think you said Africa being the circle and then Europe being the missile.
Sure. Well, I think the reason why Kamau was obsessed with like visualizing cosmologies is because it's a worldview, right? So, you know, the circle, and I'm glad Nagar is here as a practitioner of Palo, but the circle is really the Congo cosmogram. So it's like the crossroads, and it's the worldview of Central Africa, which we carry with us. And so that circle shows up in many things, right? So the ring shout is a space where the circle exists, like a breakdancing cipher or capoeira Angola, or we see that circle always returning in, I would say, like Black cosmology. If I were to super essentialize and say like the descendants of Africa, we take that circle with us. And so I think the way that Kamau was really talking about this is like, what is a disruption? What does a catastrophe do to the people that are, you know, that carry that cosmology with them and that experience something like as horrible as the Middle Passage or as horrible as colonialism, and it's a rupture. So it's a way to really think about what happens when, of course, we carry that circle with us, you know, and it still appears, but I think that we had to develop new strategies of how we could practice that circle. So even the ring shout, for example, would happen, you know, in a hush arbor, which is like, you know, out in the woods. You would clear perhaps a circle so that you could do this in safety, right? Because it was like illegal, or the drums were banned, and so and the drum is a circle, and the drum was banned. Then you use a stick as like the to keep the rhythm for the ring shout. So I think it's really just a way of thinking about the way that the forms that we carried with us. Arthur Jafa spoke about, you know, the things that we carried with us were the things that we could actualize immediately, whether that was dance and music. And it would take longer for us to be able to create architecture, right? Or those kinds of things. And he always talks about Black film needing to catch up to Black music, just because, you know, we were able to actualize it immediately. So I think that concept of the circle is another one of those things that is just immediate. And the ring shout has even been spoken about as like a universalizing form for African people from different contexts, different faiths. You know, they talk about the fact that, you know, obviously you can see that African traditional religions are a part of it, but then the layers of Christian music and even some philosophy, and then also Islam, because if people, you know, we know many people who arrived to the New World were practicing Muslims, and they knew they could never make their pilgrimage to the Kaaba. And when you walk around the Kaaba, you're also walking counterclockwise, right? So that there are so many ways that we find our spiritual traditions related to a circle, you know, finding themselves into the forms that we developed in this context. Is that answer the question? Thank you. I feel like there was another part though. Was it about loophole?
Oh no, you answered it amazingly. I was asking specifically about like the artwork and how it goes back to the circle of protection, and yeah.
Well, you know, my best friend who I went to Montessori school with, her name is Gingy McLeod. She's in fashion. She, you know, comes to art things because she's my friend. And she came to Venice. And then I also had friends who I grew up dancing with who came to Venice. And the thing that Gingy said is like, this was the safest place I've ever been. And to me, that was the most huge compliment. And I think it is about how we were able to create, you know, a kind of a loophole of retreat in Italy. And I was very worried about it because Italy had just elected a fascist president. And I'm bringing 1,000 Black people to Italy. And the fact that, you know, we were able to make it safe, make it the safest place she's ever been was the hugest, I think, I think one of the hugest articulations of how indescribable it was to be in that space together.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No questions? Anyone? Anyone? All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here.